When people think about reptiles, they imagine cold-blooded creatures driven by instinct, emotionless automatons, primitive brains trapped in scaly bodies. For 50 years, scientists agreed. Reptiles were reflex machines, nothing more. But in July 2025, researchers at the University of Lincoln proved them wrong, spectacularly wrong. Red-footed tortoises experience moods, long-term emotional states, optimism, anxiety. They feel in ways we thought impossible. And if you own one of the 6 million reptile pets in America, everything you thought you knew is outdated. Welcome to WildLeadTube, where wildlife, science, and discovery collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. This isn't ancient history. This isn't speculation. The study was published in July 2025 in the peer-reviewed journal Animal Cognition. The methodology was the same one used for decades on mammals and birds. The finding marks a paradigm shift in our understanding of what reptiles can experience, and it has immediate implications for animal welfare laws, pet care standards, and how we treat millions of captive reptiles worldwide. Here's what makes this dangerous today. 6 million American households own reptile pets. Another 8 million households across Europe. Most care standards are based on 50-year-old assumptions. Those assumptions just collapsed. To understand why this discovery is so significant, we need to follow the science. From a discredited theory in the 1960s to the breakthrough test that changed everything in 2025. I've linked all the peer-reviewed sources in the description. University of Lincoln, Animal Cognition Journal, the UK's Animal Welfare Sentience Act. The data is verified. Let me show you exactly how 50 years of science got it wrong, and what that means for the reptile sitting in your living room right now. But to understand why scientists missed this, we need to go back to where the lie began. 1957, neuroscientist Paul MacLean proposed a theory called the triune brain. The idea was simple. Human brains evolved in 3 layers. First, the reptilian complex, the basal ganglia, instinct, aggression, for basic drives, fight, flee, feed, fornicate. No emotion, no thought, just reflex. Second, the mammalian brain, the limbic system. Emotion appeared here. Care for young, social bonding. Third, the neocortex, reason, language, consciousness, unique to primates. MacLean's theory suggested reptiles were stuck at stage 1, primitive, emotionless, prisoners of instinct. I've linked the original theory in the description. The theory exploded. Carl Sagan's 1977 book, The Dragons of Eden, won a Pulitzer Prize. He wrote about the reptilian brain inside all of us, the crocodile lurking beneath our consciousness. Marketing experts used it. Political strategists weaponized it. Self-help gurus built careers on it. The lizard brain became cultural shorthand for our worst impulses and actual reptiles. They were dismissed as living fossils, relics of a simpler time. Into the 1970s, scientific papers called them intellectual dwarfs, reflex machines, creatures of very small brain. If their brains were primitive, their inner lives must be non-existent. The logic seemed airtight, but there was a problem. The evidence didn't support MacLean's model. By the 1970s, neuroscientists were finding cracks in the theory. Reptile brains weren't missing the parts MacLean identified as mammalian. They had primitive versions of the same structures. The limbic system wasn't invented by mammals. It evolved from something reptiles already had. In 2018, A Max Planck Institute study compared lizard and mouse brains at the molecular level. The conclusion shattered MacLean's framework. Both brains evolved from the same ancestral blueprint. Reptiles didn't get stuck at stage 1. They developed their own intelligent survival strategies. Different architecture, similar capabilities. Over the past 2 decades, study after study has revealed reptile intelligence, tool use, problem solving, long-term memory, spatial reasoning, social learning. Bearded dragons recognize human faces, monitor lizards, plan multi-step hunts. Turtles navigate complex mazes. Snakes make strategic decisions. But intelligence and emotion are different questions. Could reptiles learn? Yes. Could they solve problems? Absolutely. But could they feel? Could they experience moods that shape their behavior over time? That question remained unanswered until 2025. The tool that finally answered the question was borrowed from human psychology. It's called a cognitive bias test. Here's how it works in humans. Show someone an ambiguous situation. How they interpret it reveals their underlying mood. Optimistic people see potential rewards. Pessimistic people expect negative outcomes. The test had been used successfully on mammals and birds for years. Dogs, rats, starlings, monkeys. The results were consistent. Mood shapes, judgment. But it had never been tried on a reptile. For one simple reason. Scientists assumed reptiles didn't have moods to measure. Professor Anna Wilkinson and her team at the University of Lincoln designed the first cognitive bias test for reptiles. The subjects were 15 red-footed tortoises. The setup was elegant. 5 locations in a nearly square enclosure. Food bowls placed at different positions. The tortoises learned that a bowl at one specific location always contained food. Another location was always empty. For a tortoise, walking to an empty bowl wastes precious energy. They're ectothermic. Every movement has a cost. So they had motivation to learn the pattern. Then came the test. Bowls appeared at ambiguous locations between the rewarded spot and the empty spot. What would the tortoises do? The results revealed something extraordinary. The tortoises didn't all behave the same way. Some approached ambiguous bowls quickly. These optimistic tortoises interpreted uncertainty as potential reward. Others hesitated. They approached slowly or avoided ambiguous locations entirely. These pessimistic tortoises expected disappointment. Individual differences in judgment based on background emotional state. The exact signature of mood in mammals and birds. But the team needed more evidence. They ran a second test. Anxiety response to novelty. New objects in familiar environments. New textures and colors in their enclosures. The optimistic tortoises showed less anxiety. They explored confidently. The pessimistic ones were cautious, withdrawn. Same pattern. Different test. The correlation was undeniable. For researchers, this was the confirmation they needed. The gold standard of mood measurement. For pet owners, this was something else entirely. Proof that the bearded dragon they'd been treating like a decoration was experiencing emotional states they'd completely missed. July 2025. The study published in Animal Cognition. The conclusion was clear. Red-footed tortoises experience long-term mood states, free-floating affective states, unattached to specific events. This is the first clear evidence that reptiles possess a key component of sentience, the ability to have moods that influence behavior over time, not just reactions to immediate stimuli. Background emotional experience. Professor Oliver Berman called it a significant shift in our understanding of what reptiles can experience. You'll find the full study linked in the description. The study was peer-reviewed. The methodology was rigorous. The implications were enormous. Here's what makes this discovery profound. Reptiles diverged from mammals and birds over 300 million years ago. 300 million years of separate evolution. If tortoises have moods, it suggests two possibilities. Either the common ancestor of all three groups already had affective states, which means emotions are at least 300 million years old, older than we thought, more widespread than we imagined, or reptiles evolved moods independently. Convergent evolution, different brain architecture, same emotional capacity. Either way, the simplification is this. Emotions aren't a mammalian invention. They're ancient. They're fundamental. They appear in creatures we dismissed as primitive. And that means the line between so-called lower animals and higher animals is fiction. Researchers have known for years that MacLean's triune brain was wrong, that knowledge lived in academic papers, behind paywalls, in specialized journals. Meanwhile, millions of people bought reptile pets, thinking they were purchasing living decorations, low-maintenance ornaments, animals that don't feel, don't care, don't remember. The tortoise study opens a door. If one reptile species experiences moods, what about the others? 10,000 reptile species exist today. Lizards, snakes, crocodilians, turtles. Do bearded dragons feel optimistic some days and anxious others? Do ball pythons have emotional responses to their environment? Do monitor lizards experience moods that shape their behavior? We don't know. The research hasn't been done. But the assumption that they don't has been shattered. The burden of proof has shifted. For 50 years, we assumed reptiles couldn't feel unless proven otherwise. Now the question is reversed. Which reptiles don't have this capacity? And why would evolution remove something so fundamental? Professor Anna Wilkinson made a critical point. Animal welfare concerns rely on evidence that a species has the capacity to experience suffering. For decades, that evidence didn't exist for reptiles, not because they couldn't suffer, because we weren't looking in the right way. We were measuring reptile behavior against mammalian expressions of emotion. Facial expressions, vocalizations, social bonding. Reptiles express emotion differently. They don't smile. They don't vocalize distress the way mammals do. Their social structures are different. So we concluded they had nothing to express. We mistook our inability to read them for their inability to feel. And millions of reptiles in captivity paid the price for that mistake. What makes this dangerous today is scale. 6 million households in the United States own reptiles. Another 2.1 million in France, 1.5 million in Spain, 1.4 million in Italy. Right now, those reptiles are being cared for using standards based on outdated assumptions: enclosure size, temperature regulation, diet. Most guidelines focus on physical health, not emotional well-being. Bearded dragons spend their lives in glass tanks. No variability, no enrichment, no opportunity for the complex behaviors they evolved to perform. And their owners have no idea those behaviors even exist. Because the prevailing wisdom said reptiles don't need enrichment. They don't get bored. They don't feel confined. They're reptiles. They're fine. Reptile breeders and pet stores have profited from the low-maintenance narrative for decades. Reptiles are easy. They don't need walks. They don't need companionship. They don't need much. But scientists now know that narrative was built on false assumptions. Meanwhile, 15-year-old bearded dragons sit in tanks designed for convenience, not welfare, not emotional health, convenience. In 2022, the United Kingdom passed the Animal Welfare Sentience Act. The law recognizes that animals are sentient beings capable of experiencing pain and pleasure. It requires the government to consider animal welfare in policy decisions. Reptiles are included, but implementation has been slow because the scientific evidence for reptile sentience was thin. The Lincoln study changes that. Right now, the law exists. The evidence exists, but the care standards haven't caught up. Reptile welfare guidelines in most countries were written in the 1990s and early 2000s, before we knew what we know now. The legal framework is there. The ethical obligation is clear. Update the standards, improve the conditions, treat sentient beings like sentient beings. The question is whether governments and industries will act on the science or continue operating on outdated assumptions, because change is expensive. All sources are linked in the description. If you own a reptile, here's what you need to understand right now. Your pet is not a low-maintenance decoration. It experiences moods. It can feel optimistic or anxious depending on its environment. That means enrichment matters. Variability matters. Appropriate temperature gradients, hiding spots, opportunities for natural behaviors. These aren't luxuries. They're requirements for emotional well-being. Veterinarians specializing in reptiles have known for years that environmental stress affects reptile health. Now we know it affects their emotional state too. A reptile kept in poor conditions isn't just unhealthy. It's pessimistic, anxious, suffering in ways we couldn't measure until now. The cognitive bias test gives us a tool, a way to assess reptile welfare objectively, to measure whether captive conditions are meeting their emotional needs. That tool didn't exist 2 years ago. It exists today. So what should you take from this? First, understand that scientific consensus can be wrong for decades. The reptilian brain myth dominated neuroscience and popular culture for 50 years. It shaped how we treated an entire class of animals, and it was based on outdated comparative anatomy. When better tools became available, the myth collapsed. Trust the evidence, not the narrative. Second, recognize that intelligence and emotion exist in forms we don't immediately recognize. Reptiles don't express feelings the way mammals do. That doesn't mean those feelings don't exist. It means we need to look harder, listen differently, design better tests. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Third, if you care for a reptile, you have an ethical obligation to provide for its emotional well-being, not just its physical health, housing, temperature, diet. Those are baseline now. We know reptiles need environments that support optimistic mood states, enrichment, complexity, choice. That's the new standard. There's a deeper lesson here. We are remarkably good at underestimating other species. We did it with birds. We did it with fish. We did it with invertebrates. And we did it with reptiles. Every time we develop tools sensitive enough to detect what's actually happening, we find more complexity than we expected, more intelligence, more emotion, more inner life. The problem was never that animals lacked these capacities. The problem was that we lacked the humility to assume they had them. until proven otherwise. Right now, we're at the beginning of the reptile sentience revolution. Tortoises are confirmed. The rest of the class is under investigation. And the scientists who dedicate their careers to this work are telling us the same thing every time. We were wrong, they feel. If this changed how you see reptiles, subscribe, because the next video will show you something even more unexpected. Scientists just discovered that fish can recognize themselves in mirrors, the mirror test. The gold standard of self-awareness, fish. I'll show you the evidence, the controversy, and what it means for our understanding of consciousness itself. Can a fish have a sense of self? The answer might surprise you. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the present. Science is rewriting the rules, and WildLeadTube has the discoveries. I'll show you where to look.